Serena Gonzalez, and I'm going to be talking about why humans have a negative impact on coral reefs. So I'm going to be separating my argument into three different reasons why humans have been devastating the coral reef population. The first one is going to be overfishing, the second one is going to be the chemicals that we produce, and the third one is going to be the trash that ends up in coral reefs. So overfishing, it leads to the loss of predators and prey in coral reefs. What does that mean? If a predator ends up leaving, then a prey population would end up rising. So if you need a specific animal to hunt another to keep the population low, and the population of the predator suddenly leaves, then we're going to have an abundance of a certain species that we don't really need necessarily. Also, keystone species. So keystone species, a big one in coral reefs are sharks. So sharks keep fish away from coral reefs that are not necessary, and humans have been overfishing sharks lately in the past decade. So 90% of the Mediterranean fish populations are now harvested in excess, and the population of sharks is experiencing significant decline, with perhaps 100 million or more sharks lost each year, according to FIU News. So that means that one of the most important species in the coral reef ecosystem is essentially lost because of humans and their need for fishing. So chemicals, humans have a tendency to produce chemicals not necessarily on purpose, but through their actions. Factories, sunblock, the pharmaceutical industry. So we're going to start off by talking about sunblock. Sunblock, it could affect the pH of the ocean, and with that being said, coral reefs need a specific pH balance to produce their structure. So with the presence of sunblock and their harmful chemicals, it leads to a very extreme decline in corals. So between 6,000 and 14,000 tons of sunscreen lotion made, many of which contain 1 and 10% BP3, which is a chemical that is known to hurt organisms such as corals, are estimated to be released into the coral reef areas each year, and this was a Springerling research study. And then another important chemical is produced in sewage. So sewage is actually being put into the ocean constantly by humans. The largest component of coastally derived pollution is actually sewage, and that was a study from the New York Library. This has a big impact on coral reefs, because with the sewage happening and the pH being affected, like I said before, corals are struggling to keep their structure and essentially grow, and it also hurts the reproduction of them. And with that being said, pills are also a big problem. The pharmaceutical industry actually distributes so many pills each year, and when humans don't know what to do with pills, they either throw them away or they flush them down the toilet, and either way they lead into the ocean through the water cycle. That also affects the pH, as I said before. And blood and plasma in larger fish and sea animals in the coral reefs have been said to have some of the traces of pills. This is by oceancrusaders.org. And along with oil spills, pesticides, and a chemical called BPA, these are very large pollutants of the coral reefs, also produced by humans. So BPA is found in plastic. Humans produce a lot of trash, and with the trash it goes into the ocean. BPA is bisphenol A, and it's a chemical in styrofoam and in plastic, and that essentially hurts the coral reefs as well. So lastly, I'd like to talk about the trash. So trash, fishing gear. Fishing gear is a big problem in coral reefs. Corals are sessile, and that means they are non-moving organisms, so they stay still and they aren't able they're not able to move away from falling debris. So with that being said, it interferes with their photosynthesis, so they are no longer able to produce or to essentially eat and get energy. So with all the trash and debris falling down, they are forced to live with it on them, and that's a huge problem. And yeah, a lot of all of these are the components of why coral reefs have been in such decline, and humans have a huge impact. This is very important, and I hope you see why now, and I thank you for listening.
Right, well, the proposition's identified, although it's stated as a question and then an answer, is kind of like it's an informative speech. You're going to tell us why something is happening. You're not making a declarative sentence telling us this is happening, and that's what the argument needs to do. It needs to make a declaration that this is the position that you're taking. So the phrasing on it is a little unclear. We know generally what the topic is. I get an idea about what your position is. I know how I would phrase the proposition, but you need to be doing that so it's easy for everybody to follow. There's a preview of what the supporting points are going to be, not necessarily as claims, but at least as topic areas, and I think it would be good to have claims also. The part that's a little bit confusing is whether or not there's any dispute about this. Toward the end of your speech, you've mentioned the decline in coral reefs, but I didn't hear any data that talked about a decline in coral reefs. I heard potential threats to coral reefs, but I didn't see any information to suggest that there are fewer coral reefs than there once were, or that the ones that are in existence are on the brink of extinction. I'm sure that that kind of data is available, so you should probably make sure that you have that early on in the speech so we know that your issue is real. But the other controversy is whether or not anybody disputes these particular positions. I think on some of them there might be some dispute about how big an impact some of these things have on the coral reefs, but I'm not sure that all of them are going to be dismissed as irrelevant. So then the question is, well, why do we have a dispute? Do we have inadequate rules? Are we ignoring the signs that were in front of us that would prevent us from acting in this way? I think there's a little bit more controversy on some of those points. You do signpost the major points as you get to them, so I think that that's appreciated. The overfishing argument is mostly dependent on your example of sharks, and you've got some detail about the number of sharks that are eliminated each year. There's a long description about how the sharks might be important to the predator and the prey and all that sort of thing. But I don't know what the total shark population is. 100 million every year seems like it's a lot, but you know what? I don't know how many people die every year, but it's probably 100 million easily. If we got billions of sharks, then 100 million sharks each year isn't that big a deal. Is there any way to give us some estimate about whether or not that is in fact going to make a difference? And this would be a good place to have some of that information that shows that there has been a decline in coral reefs, especially if there's a way to link it to the shark populations in those particular areas. The chemical issue, it's mostly explained as an idea that that there are inconsistencies with the chemicals that are sometimes put into the ocean with the health of coral reefs. I don't know where coral reefs are located in all parts of the world. If we're talking about the United States and we're talking about sunblock and other things getting released into the ocean, I don't know that the United States has a bunch of coral reefs except maybe off of Florida and maybe off of Hawaii. Other than that, it seems like the sewage issue would not be a big problem. Maybe it is. Like I said, I think you need to get something that's a little bit more directly related to that. The amount of tonnage of this chemical in the sunblock that gets released sounds substantial, but not necessarily in contrast to the size of the ocean. And so the question is this at concentration levels high enough to cause the damage? And I think you need to have the link evidence on that particular point. The trash issue, generally people don't like the idea of trash and plastic and that sort of thing. I can understand the idea that, look, stuff lands on top of the coral reef and that creates a problem for the coral reef, but is stuff being distributed in places like that? Do we have examples of coral reef that have been wiped out or diminished because the presence of trash in the area? That would make your argument a little bit more consistent. I thought you did a nice job speaking to the audience for the most part. There was one source citation that sounds like it's the New York Library. That is a little confusing. And you have a tendency to cite your evidence after it's being presented instead of before it's being presented, and that gets also confusing. All right, thank you.